Welcome to the Depth Dive. We take fascinating topics and really try to distill what's important from the sources you send our way.
Yeah, break it down.
Exactly. So today, we're diving into a very specific source, one with a really distinct view on 9/11. Our job here, just to be clear, isn't about agreeing or disagreeing. It's about understanding and laying out the specific claims this source makes.
Right.
We want to explore it thoroughly, neutrally, just so you get what this particular viewpoint is arguing. Okay, let's unpack this.
Right. So the objective is really just to synthesize what this source actually asserts. And it frames 9/11 as, well, a state-planned and executed false flag attack.
A false flag, meaning they're saying the state did it but made it look like someone else.
That's the definition,
Yeah.
yes. And also a controlled demolition, big claims. And to back this up, the source offers what it specifically calls 3 facts, plus, a bunch of other broader allegations that we should probably get into as well.
Okay, 3 facts. So where does it start? What's the first one?
Well, the source opens with something very specific, what it calls key evidence. It's about aircraft engine parts, supposedly found on Murray Street.
Engine parts, okay.
And right away, it jumps to this massive conclusion, saying this single finding individually proves that 9/11 was a state-planned and executed false flag attack.
Wow, okay, so one piece of alleged evidence proves the whole thing. That's quite a leap.
It is. And what's fascinating here is the level of detail the source goes into about engine models to try and justify that leap. It claims the parts found on Murray Street, quote, did not belong to any of the 4 missing airliners on 9/11.
None of them.
None of them, according to the source. It says the engine was found in line with the alleged Flight 175 impact. That's the South Tower plane. Now, the source states Flight 175 was a Boeing 767-22 using a JT-9740 engine. That's, a twin-engine jet.
Right, a 7607.
But the engine they found, the source claims it was a JT-97 series, which it says is exclusively used on Boeing 747 models.
A 747, that's the big 4-engine one, totally different plane.
Exactly. And they add that Flight 11, the other tower plane, was also a 767. So their conclusion is this engine couldn't have come from either plane involved.
Okay.
Therefore, the source argues, the second plane was in fact not Flight 175. It suggests maybe attack drones were used instead. And the thinking seems to be the planners didn't expect engines to survive these, quote, demolitions.
Huh. So if the source is saying it's a 747 engine, not a 767 engine, do they explain how a 747 engine would even get there? Or why that automatically means false flag instead of, I don't know, some other explanation?
That's the thing. They don't really get into the how. The source just presents the discrepancy itself as the proofs. The logic is basically, engine doesn't match the plane, therefore the plane wasn't the plane reported, therefore it's a deception, a false flag. It's very direct.
Okay. So from engines, where does the source go next? You mentioned other points.
Yeah, it shifts focus pretty dramatically, moving inside the buildings and starts talking about explosions.
Explosions. Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, I imagine. Lots of eyewitness stuff.
Definitely. And this part really makes you think about how eyewitness accounts are selected and framed in this narrative. The source alleges, pre-weakening thermite charges were set off to weaken the core, supposedly a minute before the first collapse.
Thermite before the collapse.
That's the claim, causing the lobby to, quote, fill with thick white smoke. It even claims agents did everything to prevent people filming it. It includes dialogue like, what's your badge number? Get out. Don't turn around. 44. Very specific.
Oh.
And then it pulls together various accounts describing, heavy-duty explosions, a secondary explosion, another rumble, a big explosion from much, much lower, and even continuous explosions.
Wow, a whole range of sounds described there.
Yeah, one person's quoted saying it was the loudest sound I've ever heard in my life and that they were blown across the lobby, lost their tools.
Blown across the lobby.
The source also points to, visual things. Explosive material hitting this column and making that bulge, windows blown away, even fireproofing, burned and glazed to the steel.
Yeah.
And more dialogue like bomb in the building, start clearing out.
So it's presenting these accounts as pretty definitive proof of bombs. Does it mention how these accounts fit with, say, other people who didn't report hearing bombs, or explanations for loud noises that weren't bombs?
It doesn't really engage with conflicting accounts or alternative explanations. It presents these specific testimonies as clear, direct evidence for its controlled demolition theory.
Yeah.
The implication is just that their vividness and consistency with the source's argument makes them true. It builds this picture of, pre-planned destruction.
Okay, very dramatic descriptions. So we've had the engine, the explosions. What's the third fact? You said the source called it the best evidence.
Ah, yes, the third one. This is the claim about molten steel.
Molten steel.
Yeah, the core assertion is that molten steel was found flowing and still burning red hot weeks after the demolitions.
Weeks, still red hot.
That's the claim. And the source is really emphatic here, saying, quote, "No classical demolition or office fire in any type of building has ever produced molten steel, let alone molten steel that remained red hot for weeks after the demolition."
So they're framing it as physically impossible under the official story.
Exactly. And they use these really vivid descriptions from witnesses to hammer it home. Things like molten steel running down the channel rails.
Okay.
Descriptions like you're in a foundry, like lava, or even like it was like a volcano. Really powerful imagery.
That molten steel image is definitely a powerful one in these kinds of narratives, presenting something as unprecedented, that underlines the conspiracy idea.
Absolutely. The source leans heavily on that dramatic image and the idea that it's just impossible otherwise. It pushes the demolition theory as the only way to explain this best evidence.
Okay, so those are the three facts.
Yep.
But you mentioned the source goes broader than that, into like foreknowledge and bigger conspiracies.
Oh, yeah. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the source paints a very, very comprehensive narrative. It moves beyond just the physical events. It tells this story about how certain people that the shadow government wanted alive were tipped off, told not to come to work or to come in late that day.
Right, the insider trading or foreknowledge angle, who did they mention?
The main figure highlighted is Larry Silverstein, the leaseholder of the World Trade Center complex. The source claims he was supposed to be at a meeting at the top of one of the towers early that morning, but conveniently was 10 minutes late. And his daughter, too, allegedly was meant to be at Building 7, but never showed up.
Okay, and the implication is?
Well, the source points out Silverstein then collected several $billion in insurance money, suggesting maybe this was enough money to buy a lot of people's silence. It even includes a quote it attributes to Silverstein. "Somebody told me to be that way."
Okay, so that's the foreknowledge part. What else is in this broader conspiracy section?
It gets pretty wide-ranging. There's mention of a group called Gelatin from Israel.
Gelatin.
Yeah. Allegedly doing some art thing right before 9/11, and the source claims they made shape charges that made the cartoon plane disappear.
Whoa, okay. Shape chart is making a cartoon plane disappear. That's
Yeah,
specific.
it is. Then there's mention of the odd presence of cases and cases of something called BB-18. And weirdly, the source describes BB-18 as both copper-jacketed detonation, blasting caps for plastic explosive, and industrial fastener for metal studs.
Wait, blasting caps and fasteners, those are very different things. Does it explain that?
No, it just presents both descriptions and calls the presence odd. It doesn't try to reconcile them.
Okay. What else is part of this bigger picture, according to the source?
It expands into politics quite a bit. Allegations that the Bush family profited. Claims that Barack Obama, described specifically as a black man, was made president so laws could be passed without challenge because people would fear being called racist. And it links this to a gun control crusade. It also puts forward this idea that every time a Muslim attacks or blows up something, the very next day there's a school shooting that's always suspect. He gives an example of an Ohio machete attack supposedly followed immediately by a school shooting, connecting disparate events again.
So seeing patterns, suggesting they're not coincidences but planned distractions.
That seems to be the logic, yeah. It also claims Oregon was a false flag, done to find out who's going to stand up and fight. It's really weaving together a lot of different events and issues under this shadow government umbrella.
And it culminates somewhere. What's the ultimate point of all this, according to the source?
Well, the source concludes with this quite existential belief. It says, they, the shadow government, don't want just your property and your money. And it adds, I believe, this is my personal belief, they want our souls.
Wow. Okay, from engine parts to souls. That's quite the journey. Well, this has definitely been a dense and, provocative deep dive into one very specific viewpoint on 9/11. Just to reiterate, our aim today was really just to clearly lay out the arguments and the so-called evidence presented by this source, giving you a direct look at its perspective, without us layering on our own analysis.
Yeah, and it's interesting. The source itself kind of ends with a piece of advice for its audience. It says to use your own discernment, to, quote, take everything you hear from people and use what you can and leave the rest.
Use what you can and leave the rest.
Right. So maybe a final thought for you, the listeners.
Yeah.
When you come across compelling narratives like this one, how do you actually approach understanding them? What sort of questions does that whole process spark for you as you navigate all the information out there on these really complex topics? How do you decide what to use and what to leave?